After a couple of generations of associating bacteria exclusively with danger and disease and death, people are recognizing that the story is a little bit more complicated than that, and bacteria actually are important to our well-being.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada Gore. This is episode 114, and my guest is Sandor Katz, a self-described fermentation revivalist. Sandor is the author of Wild Fermentation and The Art of Fermentation. He has held hundreds of fermentation workshops around the world and has really been a catalyst to the revival of the fermentation arts. He has been called one of the unlikely rock stars of the American food scene. We are so thrilled to have him on the show today, and he takes us with him into the wild world of fermentation. He demystifies it, he describes how it transforms food and the benefits it has for us. He even takes us on a mini tour of fermented foods around the world. You're going to love this conversation. But before we get into it, a quick thank you to our sponsors. Kraut Pounder. Are you ready to get started with fermentation? Get yourself a Kraut Pounder from krautpounder.com. Each piece is made from solid maple natural hardwood. Visit krautpounder.com for more information. And the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. They are committed to helping all of our members nationwide pursue their dreams, from selling nutrient-dense foods from the small family farm to keeping backyard chickens to selling homemade ferments. Visit farmtoconsumer.org. And of course, the Weston A. Price Foundation. Get a free booklet today with information on Weston A. Price and the dietary principles we recommend. Just go to the website westonaprice.org and click on Request Free Info Pack, and it'll be all yours. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Sandor.
It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thanks for having me.
I know you've been traveling all around the world lately and learning about traditional fermentation practices, but I loved when I saw something on YouTube about an encounter you had with a woman on the streets in China. Tell us that story of Mrs. Ding.
At the end of 2016, I visited China with a Chinese-American friend of mine and her Chinese mother. And our ultimate destination was a small village in Guizhou province where Judy King, my friend's mother, had some connections, which was wonderful. But our first stop in China was in Chengdu, which is the capital of Sichuan province. And although we had lots of things scheduled, that first day we had nothing planned, and we were just walking around getting our bearings. And I saw some sausages hanging to cure from a window grating right on the street. That was interesting to me, so I stopped to take a photograph of the sausages. And the woman who had made them, whose name turned out to be Mrs. Ding, saw me taking pictures of her sausages, so she came out to talk to us. And we ended up having lunch with her and her husband and her son. And then she showed us how she ferments vegetables. And, it really turned into an incredible day that just unfolded from the simple fact of seeing these sausages curing on the street. But we certainly found that fermentation is very much practiced still today in households, even in urban China.
That connection that came from that moment of you're just taking pictures of that meat is just, it blows me away. And what a beautiful start to your journey in China, huh?
It was auspicious. We had such a lovely day with her and her family. We learned a lot. Actually, just in my most recent travels in South America, I met these guys who had watched that video, followed the recipe that we included for her chili oil, and presented me with some Sichuan-style chili oil made from Mrs. Ding's recipe, but this was by these guys in Brazil, in São Paulo. So that sort of brought it all full circle for me. But I love what I'm doing, teaching people about fermentation, and everywhere I go, I learn more about fermentation and try to share the things that I'm learning.
Well, that's awesome, because we're going to give you a chance to do that just now. We want to learn from you about fermentation. I want to back up just a minute from that story with Mrs. Ding and ask you about curing meat. I didn't know that was anything akin to the fermentation process.
Curing is a big word. I would say that we use curing as a word to describe any kind of post-harvest maturing of anything. So, if you heat your house with wood, you have to cure your firewood so it dries. With meat curing, often we use the word cure specifically to mean a period of drying. And what drying meat or fish or anything does is it sort of lowers the amount of water that's available, which limits the level of bacterial activity. And the lower the water level, the fewer bacteria can possibly function. And if you get it low enough, no bacteria can function. So if you were to dry meat all the way, so you get something like jerky, then you're really preserving it by depriving the microorganisms that are present on the meat of the water that they need in order to function. So all I'm saying is that the processing of meat often involves multiple processes: drying, salting, and fermentation. And they all can be described together by the word curing.
I didn't know this connection between curing and fermentation and its purpose with meat. It makes so much sense to me. I was in Peru last fall, and they talked about how they think some of the ancient civilizations had charqui, which is jerky, basically, dried meat that they would travel with that gave them the strength and energy to fight and conquer other cultures. So fascinating.
Drying is another incredibly important ancient means of food preservation. And of course, these ancient methods of food preservation that would include drying, heavy salting, fermentation, haven't always been used as just one singular method. So sometimes these methods are used in combination.
Sandor, tell us how you became so obsessed with fermentation. And I think that's your word. Tell us about that.
I've always loved fermented foods and beverages. I grew up in New York City, and we always had pickles in our refrigerator. And the kind of pickles we had were not vinegar pickles. They were fermented pickles, as most old world pickles until the middle of the 20th century have been. So I just grew up with the flavors of fermentation, feeling really drawn to these flavors, but not particularly thinking about fermentation. What first got me thinking about fermentation was a couple of years in my mid-20s. I spent following a macrobiotic diet. And one of the things that macrobiotics really emphasizes is the digestive benefit of pickles and other bacterially rich foods. And so I started noticing that these pickles that I'd been eating all of my life, when I would eat them, I could feel the salivary glands under my tongue squirting out saliva. And I began to associate these foods with literally getting my digestive juices flowing. But what really got me playing around with fermentation myself is that I moved from my hometown of New York City to rural Tennessee about 25 years ago, and I got involved in gardening. And the first year that I was gardening, I learned that all of the cabbage in the garden is ready at about the same time. All of the radishes in the garden are ready at about the same time. So facing this classic conundrum of agriculture that you get these big periods of overabundance followed by these periods of scarcity, I decided to learn how to make sauerkraut. I knew that I loved sauerkraut. I knew that sauerkraut was regarded as a strategy for preserving cabbage. And I literally looked in the joy of cooking and learned how to make sauerkraut. And I couldn't believe how deceptively simple and straightforward it was. And I loved that first sauerkraut. And, that just got me curious about fermentation. And I learned how to make yogurt. I started a sourdough and learned how to bake bread with a sourdough. I started playing around with natural wines. I got a kombucha mother. I got some kefir grains. And, it just sort of began me on this journey that continues of being interested in all things fermented and noticing that everywhere in the world there are important foods that are produced by fermentation, that most of the highest delicacies around the world are produced by fermentation, and that fermentation has all of these practical benefits for us as well.
I want to get to you on all of those, but first I have a question. Did your friends think you were just crazy when you were into all this? Because back when you were getting into it, I don't think kombucha and kefir and all these things were as well known as they are today.
No, certainly none of them were as well known as they are today, but they were no less delicious than they are today. So no, sure. Some of my friends teased me about my obsession with fermentation. I picked up this nickname that I still have, Sandor Kraut, but the products of fermentation are generally quite delicious. So people have always enjoyed eating the things that I showed up with.
So for those of us who don't know much about fermentation, let's pretend you're teaching us a class called Fermentation 101. Help us understand how these microbes in the air are somehow impacting our food and making it not only delicious, as you said, but somehow more nutritious as well.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it would be good to let go of the idea of microbes in the air being the major source of it. I mean, the microbes are already on the plants and they're already part of the animals that we eat. So everything that we eat is already living in this microbial world. And so the plants are growing out of the soil, populated by elaborate communities of microorganisms. The animals are eating the plants covered with the microorganisms. The microorganisms that come from the soil that are on the plants, they're part of everybody's digestive systems. We're functioning in this system dominated by bacteria. And, in fact, if we want to look back in time, I mean, the emerging consensus among evolutionary biologists is that all life descends from bacteria. And the corollary to this is that no multicellular form of life, whether it's a plant or an animal or a human being, has ever lived without bacteria. We're all living in the context of bacteria. So everything we eat, all of the plants and all of the animal products that make up our food are already populated by elaborate communities of microorganisms before we ever touch them. So the practice of fermentation is basically what happens after harvest, what happens when you create some specific environment. So what determines which of this myriad of microorganisms that are present on all of our food develop is environmental. So if you shred a cabbage and leave it sitting loosely in a bowl for 2 weeks, it's not going to turn itself into sauerkraut. Molds will grow on the cabbage and they could decompose a head of cabbage into a little puddle of slime that bears no resemblance to delicious, tangy, crunchy sauerkraut. And this would also be microbial transformation. So what we want to do is create a condition. When we're fermenting vegetables, all we do is we get the vegetables submerged under liquid, either their own juices that we pull out of them in the sauerkraut method, or we can add a saltwater brine solution. But either way, we're getting the vegetable submerged. Then there's no flow of oxygen. The aerobic molds can't grow, and what will dominate instead are lactic acid bacteria that are present on all plants. So generally in fermentation, rather than sort of conjuring the microorganisms from the air, we're working with what's already on the food, or in certain cases, we're introducing some starter culture that's either an isolated pure culture that's been isolated in a laboratory, like yeast that you could buy in the supermarket, or something more specialized, or sometimes just the last batch of something. That's how we make yogurt. That's how we make a sourdough starter, is just by perpetuating the previous batch, or in a few cases from a SCOBY, a symbiotic community of bacteria and yeast, as we have with kombucha or kefir.
I think I asked the air thing because I was talking to a friend who was telling me about sourdough and how San Francisco sourdough is supposed to have a certain flavor compared to sourdough made in another part of the nation because of something in the air. That's what she was saying. And I don't know if that hypothesis was true or not. So I did want to ask you about that.
Sure. I mean, I hear that a little bit in relation to San Francisco sourdough. But I mean, really the defining characteristic of any sourdough, and actually we're learning so much more about this from current research that's going on, is basically that the wheat or whatever kind of grain we're feeding them is covered with microorganisms. So sure, I mean, humidity and temperature conditions certainly have some bearing for the selection of what will succeed in a given environment. But what really constitutes the community of organisms that we're talking about in a sourdough is what's on the flour that we're feeding the sourdough to. So sourdoughs are notoriously unstable. You take a sourdough from one place to somewhere else and start feeding it some other flour, and it's really going to become its new environment. But that has as much to do with what you're feeding it as the environment itself.
Coming up, Sandor describes the many benefits of fermentation, and he even takes us with him on a mini tour of the fermented foods he's tried on his travels around the world. We pause now to acknowledge our sponsors. Are you ready to get started with fermenting? Well, then get yourself a kraut pounder from krautpounder.com. Kraut Pounder makes beautiful pieces for the process. You might as well do it in style. Each kraut pounder is turned from a solid piece of maple, natural hardwood. They each have their own unique markings and are finished with natural walnut oil. These are quality pounders that were inspired by a kraut pounder that belonged to the grandmother of a member of the Eugene, Oregon Weston A. Price chapter. You've got to check it out. So go to krautpounder.com and get fermenting today. And the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. Did you know they offer annual memberships for farmers, consumers, homesteaders, artisan food producers, and affiliate communities in the United States? Membership benefits include unlimited consultation with attorneys on matters within the mission statement, access to the toll-free 24/7 hotline to speak with an attorney if there is a surprise visit or inspection, unlimited consultation with their farm and dairy consultants, free possible legal representation if there's a court case, support for other members, attorneys who work at steeply discounted rates, and the list goes on and on. Check them out at farmtoconsumer.org, and you can know that gift memberships are also available. So go to farmtoconsumer.org/join. And of course, the Weston A. Price Foundation. As I said earlier, you are welcome to request a free packet with information on who Dr. Price was and how his discoveries can help benefit us today. Just go to the website westonaprice.org and click on the Request Free Info Pack button. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about the benefits. Once you've fermented, let's say, some cabbage and turned it into sauerkraut, what makes it so potent for the human body and for the digestion?
Well, I would say that there are a number of benefits from fermentation. I'll enumerate 4 of them. Number 1, I'll call predigestion. This is the simple idea that nutrients in the food are being broken down before you eat them, generally into simpler, more easily accessible forms. Number 2 is detoxification. Essentially the same thing as predigestion, except that toxic rather than nutritious compounds also get broken down. And around the world, there are all kinds of examples of foods that are toxic without fermentation, and fermentation makes them safe to eat. Third would be nutrient enhancement, the enhancement of B vitamin values, K vitamins, various organic acids. And these 3 benefits accrue to the fermentation whether you cook it after the fermentation or not. The final and most profound benefit of fermentation would be the bacteria themselves. And we're learning so much about all the important roles that bacteria play in our lives. They enable us to effectively digest food. They are the primary actors in our immune systems. We're learning that they regulate our brain chemistry and really almost every system of our bodies. And basically, from chemical exposure, from narrower diets, eating more processed foods, fewer fibers, we're finding just a diminished biodiversity in the human gut microbiome. So I think of eating these live fermented foods that haven't been pasteurized or cooked after their fermentation, as really a strategy for restoring biodiversity in the gut. And that can potentially have all kinds of benefits for us.
I see a parallel between what's happening in our gut and what's happening on the soil around the world. We've talked about the dangers of having monoculture, monocrops, big fields out west of just one crop, corn or soy or wheat, how those soils are not as healthy as those that have a variety of plants and crops growing. So the same is true of our digestion tract, right?
Biodiversity really underlies all kinds of crises, whether they're imbalances in the environment around us or imbalances in the environment within us.
I'm also thinking back to what you were saying a moment ago about detoxing and how the fermentation process can kind of neutralize some things that may be harmful. I think in your book, Wild Fermentation, you talked about this particularly related to the food cassava.
Cassava, yuca, manioc or mandioca is a really important food. I just got back from Brazil where, every meal features what they call mandioca there. It comes from the Amazon originally, but now all around the equatorial parts of the world, it's an important food. But in certain soils, and I've heard about this mostly in the Amazon, in the Caribbean, and in West Africa, yuca grows with these extraordinarily high levels of cyanide. If people tried to eat unprocessed cassava roots, they would kill them. And the simple method for processing it is fermentation. Various methods. What I had always heard about before this trip was peeling the cassava, coarsely chopping it and putting it in a bucket of water, and the water initiates a fermentation that breaks down the cyanide compounds. I also learned on this trip of a method of juicing it and then fermenting that juice. In the Amazon, they make this amazing condiment that they call tucupi. They cook down the fermented juice of the cassava with some ants, and it's so delicious. We started calling it Amazon miso.
I'm just aghast about the ants, but it's all good because I know it's part of the wise traditions around the world.
Don't be aghast at eating ants. I mean, it's our major underutilized food resource is insects. And, if we truly have issues with food scarcity, which, personally I'm somewhat skeptical about, then we need to use these untapped sources. And ants happen to be an amazing source of flavor. Many species of ants have this acid called formic acid, which is just a delicious sour accent. It provides protein, vitamin B12, all kinds of important nutrients, and this delicious sourness.
Talk to us about something else that you tried, Sandor. I mean, I'm into the ants. That's fine about the ants. But I'm curious. You've persuaded me about the ants. But talk to me a little bit more about something else that you tried that was kind of unique in some part of the world where I haven't been.
You started by asking me about my visit in China, and one thing that I saw in the small village that I visited where, really they were producing virtually all of their own food in the village, and they were doing an incredible amount of fermentation. But one of the things they were doing, which we were served at almost every meal, was fermenting fish. It was a freshwater carp in a bed of rice and spices and salt. And they'd ferment it for months, eat it essentially raw, sometimes like lightly heated up, but never like really cooked afterwards. And they did the same thing with pork, where they were fermenting it in a bed of rice along with salt and spices. This was delicious. But it was also so practical for, people in a remote place, far from anything like a supermarket, to be able to preserve food from seasons of plenty to get them through season of relative scarcity. And it was just incredibly delicious. And, on the same trip, I also visited Japan. And sushi has become this global food. But what is sushi without a refrigerator? The kind of sushi that we all know and love is only possible with refrigeration. And so there are all of these strategies that people, particularly around Asia, have used to preserve fish in a bed of rice. And the bed of rice is critical because that's the carbohydrate. That's the source of the carbohydrates that ferment into the acids that enable the fish to be effectively preserved.
That is so fascinating. I had no idea about that. I'm letting it sink in. I've really been craving sushi lately. Why would that be? Is that part of my digestion just saying, come on, bring me some of that good raw?
Well, I don't know. Sushi is delicious. I mean, I crave fish and the beautiful, fresh flavor of raw fish myself. But it was just so fascinating for me to get a chance to taste preserved sushi, old sushi. I had sushi that was more than a year old, and it was delicious, and it just tasted really, really acidic. Like the fermentation of rice had yielded a flavor that was something like a lemon.
Wow.
And that sourness effectively preserved the fish.
Sounds amazing. It reminds me of ceviche that I had in Peru. So good. Now, one thing we're convinced of here in the Wise Traditions family is that these traditional food techniques like fermentation, which you've been describing around the world, are so good for our health. Did you find that the people that you met that were eating this way seemed particularly healthy? How did they seem to you, Sandor?
I certainly was not doing anything like Weston A. Price style, where I was like, trying to get people to tell me about their diet and then tell me about their health. So, contemporary China and Japan, it's not as if most people are eating a diet where they're only eating traditional foods. So, the traditions still exist, but there's, an incredible amount of highly processed foods that people are eating, foods that are made with lots of chemicals. It's really hard for me to draw any kind of generalizations like that. Interestingly, talking to Mrs. Ding about the renewed interest, just to get back to the person we started this conversation talking about, when we talked about the renewed interest in fermentation and people associating fermentation with good health, she was a little bit dismissive of that and said, well, we just eat it because it tastes so good. I would imagine that in traditional Chinese medicine, they would certainly have an analysis of it that recognized some of the ways that fermented foods can be important. And I certainly know in some of the historical Chinese literature I've looked at, there is such an acknowledgement. But for this one 60-something-year-old Chinese woman who's been doing this for a long time, it was just the thing that makes food taste so good, and she was not thinking about it primarily in terms of health.
Well, I want to ask you two questions as we start to wrap up. You wrote your book, Wild Fermentation, I think over 15 years ago now. What has changed since you first began looking into this fermentation food scene?
Clearly, there has been a growing interest in fermentation. And, more than anything else, I guess I would attribute that to news about the microbiome. And, just a growing recognition that bacteria are important to us. And so, after a couple of generations of associating bacteria exclusively with danger and disease and death, people are recognizing that the story is a little bit more complicated than that, and bacteria actually are important to our well-being. And so I think a growing popular awareness of this is inevitably leading to a growing interest in fermented foods and beverages. And so my experience really everywhere that I've gone, I mean, not only in, North America, but just now in South America, when I did workshops last year in Japan and in Hong Kong, when I was in Europe last year, but I mean, really everywhere that I have traveled to give workshops, it's been to packed houses. I mean, there just is a lot of interest at the present time in the phenomenon of fermentation, although there's nothing new about fermentation. And, I like to point out that the products of fermentation themselves have never, ever waned in popularity. The products of fermentation have always been popular. It's just that, now people are more aware of the process of fermentation and asking more questions about it, which is a great thing.
And that's why we had you on, because we want to find out more about fermentation from Sandor, and we want to definitely talk to you again. I have one final question I want to pose before we let you go. If the listener could do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do, maybe even in relation to fermentation?
Well, I mean, I would just say start fermenting vegetables. I mean, you can ferment any kind of vegetables. The sauerkraut method, the dry salting method is the easiest way. For a vessel, work with a quart-sized jar. Wide mouth is easier than a narrow mouth. So if you have a quart-sized mason jar, that's wide mouth, that's perfect. Then that'll take about 2 pounds of vegetables or a kilo of vegetables to fill it up. Chop up the vegetables coarsely or finely as you like. Lightly salt them to taste. Get in with your hands and squeeze the vegetables for 5 minutes until they're nice and juicy. Once the veggies are juicy, make sure you have adequate salt, add any seasoning you like, and just pack it into the jar so that you eliminate air pockets and get the vegetables submerged under their own juices. And then wait. Give it 4 days and then taste it, and then pack it back down and wait a little bit longer. And taste it every few days, and you'll familiarize yourself with the spectrum of flavors that are possible. And if one day you taste it and think, wow, this is getting strong, I don't want this to get any stronger, then move it into your fermentation slowing device, your refrigerator. But fermenting vegetables, making sauerkraut like that is just the perfect way to enhance any kind of meal. You're having oatmeal for breakfast, you want to just, give it a little extra zing, put some of your sauerkraut in it. You're making a sandwich, you want to make it a little special, give it a little spice, give it a little bit of probiotics, add a little bit of sauerkraut to it. I mean, it just is the perfect enhancement to every quick meal you're going to eat in the next month.
Sandor, I love it. You just gave us like a 2-minute workshop on how to make sauerkraut. That is fantastic. It really has been a joy. Please tell us you'll be on again sometime.
I'd be so happy to be on, and please check out my books. My first book, Wild Fermentation, even has a foreword by Sally Fallon, and my other book is The Art of Fermentation. Thank you so much for having me on.
Excellent. We'll put those links in the show notes so people can get your books, and all the resources will also link to your website. And we'll talk to you again sometime, Sandor. Thanks again.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. My guest today was Sandor Katz. To connect with him, go to his website, wildfermentation.com. For an overview of today's discussion and links to the resources we mentioned on the show, go to westonaprice.org, click on the tab for blogs and podcasts, and find the show notes for episode 114. Hey, and a big thank you to my friends at Podcast Village. Charlie Burney and his team are phenomenal at what they do. They are pros when it comes to training, producing, and promoting podcasts. Check them out at podcastvillage.com. Special thanks today to editor Rob Ford and the team of interns who help with the show: Cynthia Castro Cohen Enriquez, Joy de los Santos, Elisa Canty, and Lily Hempft. Thanks also to Amy Marvin for her help transcribing episodes. Hey, and next week's episode, you guys, is going to be off the chain. Do people still say that? But it's going to be amazing. It's a fascinating discussion about estrogenics, the hormone disruptors that are all around us and can interrupt our normal body function. My guest is Dr. Anthony J., and he gets into very practical tips about how to avoid those toxins and help our bodies restore their proper function. You don't want to miss it, so stay tuned. Hey, and don't forget to look for me personally at Holistic Hilda on Twitter, at Holistic_Hilda on Instagram. I love to connect with you about anything pertaining to the podcast or anything related to health and wellness. Thanks so much for your support and keep on listening.
Did you know that there are Weston A. Price Foundation chapters all over the U.S. and around the world? Chapter leaders help you find good food in your area, and some have meetings you can attend. Go to our website, westonaprice.org, and click on Find a Local Chapter to see if there is one near you. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.